On May 4, 1945, the British heavy cruiser HMS Norfolk sailed inside a dense destroyer screen. Deep below the surface, a firing solution was locked. The distance was about 500 meters, roughly 1,600 feet. The hunting weapon was U-2511. It was U-2511, a Type XXI electro boot, built for sustained submerged operations with minimal need to surface. Commander Adalbert Schnee held the lethal firing solution. He possessed the speed and the stealth to execute a devastating strike and vanish before the escorts could deploy depth charges. The kill was mathematically certain, yet he stepped back from the periscope. He ordered a silent withdrawal without firing a single torpedo. This irreversible step marked the end of the combat patrol. This single encounter established the supreme technological baseline of the Type XXI submarine. Before this machine, submarines were highly vulnerable surface vessels that merely dived to escape or execute short ambush attacks. Their submerged mobility was strictly limited by small battery capacities and slow underwater speeds. U-2511 reversed this engineering logic completely. It was designed as a true continuous submerged platform. Its massive internal hull volume was packed with unprecedented electrical battery arrays. These advanced power banks fed powerful silent running motors, pushing the heavy pressure hull through the ocean with minimal acoustic signature. When required, the boat could unleash a sprint speed of 17.2 knots entirely underwater. This capability fundamentally altered naval architecture. At that underwater sprint speed, it could reposition faster than escorts expected, slip through screens, and dictate the geometry of the engagement on its own terms. By penetrating the destroyer screen and locking onto HMS Norfolk, the machine provided pure tactical validation of its absolute stealth capability. Reportedly, the British sonar operators never gained a firm contact. The advanced hydrodynamics of the hull and the acoustic damping of the electrical systems performed exactly as designed. The mock attack proved the engineering theory in a live combat environment. The boat could move through heavy defensive perimeters without being detected. However, the demonstration collided with a hard operational limit. Hours before the approach, a general ceasefire order had gone out across military channels. Schnee weighed the instinct to strike against direct compliance, then withheld fire and withdrew in silence. That single act ended the patrol and sent the boat back toward port as an intact surrender. This disciplined restraint spared the vessel from certain combat destruction. It preserved the submarine as a fully operational, surviving testbed. The stakes for the victorious Allied forces were immense. They were not merely taking an enemy ship, they were seizing a blueprint. Every naval intelligence officer understood what the pressure hull contained: layout, battery architecture, and silent running motors that would force navies to rethink anti-submarine tactics. Allied command wanted the physical evidence for study and reverse engineering, and the boat arrived as a complete, working testbed. The question remained, what happens to the most advanced aquatic weapon in the world once it has been handed over intact? The endgame would be decided at sea. The Allied intelligence teams had already finished extracting the necessary architectural data from the surrendered submarine. Following this intelligence gathering phase, the Allies moved to a disposal plan later known as Operation Deadlight. The decision was blunt and practical. Only a limited number of captured submarines would be retained for trials and evaluation, and the remainder would be taken out to sea and sunk under controlled conditions. The captured fleet was towed into designated areas of the North Atlantic and scuttled, sometimes by charges, sometimes by gunfire, with the intent of removing the boats from service and keeping them out of circulation. In theory, the deeper the water, the harder it would be for anyone to interfere with what was left behind. On January 7, 1946, the captured vessel was secured to the rescue tug by a heavy towing hawser and dragged toward a designated deep water disposal point. A winter front was closing fast, shrinking the weather window by the hour. In heavy seas, an unpowered submarine becomes a dead weight that surges and yaws against the line, each lift and drop of the hull translated into violent, repeated shock loads through the hawser and rigging. Under the relentless strain of these ocean conditions, the primary heavy tow cable parted. The steel line failed catastrophically and the submarine was cast adrift. The unmanned hull immediately began wallowing violently in the heavy swells, rolling unpredictably without any power or steering control. The naval crews aboard the escorting vessels evaluated the immediate environmental hazard. Attempting to pass and secure a new heavy tow line to a drifting, highly unstable hull in gale-force winds was deemed an unacceptable operational risk. The physical threshold of the weather had completely defeated the primary deep water disposal plan. With the tow permanently abandoned, the drifting steel asset became an immediate and severe navigational hazard in the open ocean. With the tow permanently abandoned, the drifting steel asset became an immediate and severe navigational hazard in the open ocean. An escorting British warship moved into position to eliminate the threat before darkness fell. On January 7, 1946, the ship used naval gunfire to deliberately sink the drifting submarine. Heavy shells tore into the metal hull, and the vessel foundered well short of the intended disposal area. It plunged toward the seabed off the coast of Ireland. Because the sinking was forced prematurely by the weather constraint, naval authorities recorded the exact early scuttle coordinates. This positive knowledge gain established the wreck location far closer to shore than originally intended. However, the environmental limit of the towing hawser dictated a harsh new reality for the vessel. The sheer physical failure of a metal rope against North Atlantic forces locked the wreck at a highly problematic depth. The submarine bottomed out at about 226 feet, around 69 meters, on a white sandy seabed. The deep water mandate had failed, but the vessel was still swallowed by a severe environmental denial regime. At 226 feet, the extreme water pressure and total darkness presented a formidable barrier to any human access. The final resting place was shallow enough to be located by advanced surface sensors, but deep enough to be beyond routine recreational diving. Reachable only by trained technical divers, the ocean itself became the final vault, strictly governing who could approach the site. Once locked at 226 feet beneath the North Atlantic, how could investigators ever document the site without destroying it? Surveying a protected historical structure in the deep ocean creates an immediate geometry trap. Standard maritime search often uses heavy anchors, grapnels, or shot lines dropped from the surface to give divers a stable reference. But dropping iron hardware directly onto a deteriorating mid-century steel submarine can crush the very evidence the team intends to document. In 2001, an archaeological survey expedition arrived above the recorded coordinates. To preserve the site, they avoided fixing anything into the wreck itself. Instead, they established their descent reference clear of the hull and made a controlled drop through the water column, fighting lateral currents in the dark. The margin for navigational error was still razor thin. Drift too far, and the target would vanish into open sand and cold water. Leaving the surface meant immediately crossing a severe physiological boundary. At the target depth, the crushing pressure and darkness changed the rules of human work. Breathing standard air became unsafe. Narcosis could be severe, and oxygen partial pressure climbed into a risk zone. The team used technical mixed gas protocols, swapping much of the nitrogen for helium to preserve clarity in cold water. But inert gas still dissolved into tissue minute by minute, turning every moment on the wreck into a debt that had to be paid back on ascent. This physiological reality dictated a brutal deep survey arithmetic. The divers were bound by an absolute calculation that could not be negotiated. They were granted only about 20 minutes of bottom time. Within that tiny window, they had to locate the massive steel target in the dark ambient water, orient themselves along the structure, and record the site mechanically. Those minutes of deep observation carried a steep physical penalty. To safely return to the surface, the team then faced roughly 2 hours of staged decompression in the freezing open ocean, holding depth stops while their bodies cleared the inert gas load and reduced the risk of decompression sickness. The strict non-intrusive protocol was flawlessly maintained during that brief, high-stakes window. Once the divers made visual contact with the white, sandy seabed, they executed a methodical, hovering perimeter swim. They minimized contact with the metal hull, avoided disturbing the resting environment, and carried no heavy tools for physical recovery. Their sole objective was establishing a visual baseline document. Buoyancy control had to be absolute. Sinking even a few inches too low would strike the white sand, instantly blinding the camera lenses with a cloud of silt and ruining the remaining minutes. Gliding alongside the massive cylindrical shape, they used high-intensity lighting and video systems to capture the first continuous optical sweep of the submarine. Within their allotted bottom time, they achieved the primary objective. They mapped the footprint of the vessel in the sand, confirmed the overall dimensions, and documented how the hull sat and oriented on the seabed, proof that a high-level technical survey could be executed without introducing physical damage. But the same pressure and time limits forced the work into a rapid, highly focused pass. Under that constraint, what did the first visual sweep of the main hull reveal? At the conclusion of the war, standard Allied disposal doctrine assumed that captured submarines would be systematically destroyed from the inside out using heavy scuttling charges. This method was designed to detonate outward, fracturing the inner pressure vessel, shattering the watertight bulkheads, and breaking the structural spine into multiple sections. The theoretical model predicted a highly fragmented wreck, yet the visual reality of the target resting in the sand completely contradicted this assumption. The massive steel structure was fundamentally whole. The external visual survey established the coherent pressure vessel. The main cylindrical body of the submarine had not suffered any catastrophic internal explosion. It rested solidly on its port side, embedded in the white sand of the ocean floor. The complex outer hydrodynamic casing and the heavy inner pressure hull remained structurally intact along the vast majority of its length. The conning tower still dominated the midsection, and the hydroplanes remained affixed to the stern. The absence of outward blast damage proved that the submarine experienced a relatively controlled foundering. It sank as a single continuous mass, retaining its heavy structural integrity all the way to the bottom. As the visual sweep progressed along the exposed starboard side of the intact midsection, investigators documented a massive, jagged breach in the plating alongside the conning tower. The damage pattern was consistent with heavy external impact, matching the historical account that the drifting boat was sunk by naval gunfire. A localized hit like this could compromise the pressure boundary and accelerate flooding, pulling the immense weight of the submarine below the surface without completely tearing the hull apart. While the naval gunfire hole explained the sinking, the overall completeness of the surrounding hull still created a severe forensic barrier. The exterior was visually accessible, and some openings were visible, an open hatch here, a torn breach there, but most internal compartments remained dark, confined, and unsurveyed. The true historical value of this submarine lay in its revolutionary internal architecture. The heavy electrical battery banks, the complex power routing systems, and the pioneering silent running motors were housed deep within the pressure compartments. From the outside, investigators could gain only limited glimpses. Confirming the condition of the drivetrain, proving the survival of battery sections, or mapping the machinery spaces in full would have required deeper entry and systematic internal work, steps the mission was not designed to take. Operational rules prohibited forced entry. There would be no prying, no cutting, no heavy tools, and no artifact removal, only observation through openings that already existed. The team could document external form and visible breaks, but the condition of the propulsion system inside the sealed compartments would remain unknown. The midship cylinder remained coherent, damaged by shell fire, but still continuous along its central spine. Then, as the sweep moved forward, the clean steel line abruptly terminated. If the main cylinder reached the seabed largely intact, what happened to the bow? Forward of the central cylindrical bulkheads, the smooth architectural profile of the submarine abruptly vanishes. The heavy inner pressure structure was originally wrapped in a highly streamlined outer bow casing, a lighter fairing built for hydrodynamics, not brute strength. On the seabed, that forward skin appears to have been torn away, leaving the pressure structure exposed. The most likely culprits are the combined violence of the sinking, the impact and stress of foundering, and decades of corrosion working the weakest seams loose. The structural shedding of this lightweight forward section dramatically altered the visual geometry of the site. With the outer casing permanently stripped away, the core offensive architecture of the submarine is completely exposed to external mapping. Investigators drifting past the damaged bow section observed the heavy forward bulkhead directly. Protruding straight through this thick steel wall are 6 massive torpedo tubes. The tubes are arranged in a tight, highly efficient vertical stacking pattern designed for rapid sequential firing. The optical survey successfully documented the precise geometric arrangement of these forward-firing tubes. This detailed visual acquisition provided direct external confirmation of the heavy forward-striking power engineered into the advanced weapon system. The survey team achieved this vital positive mapping strictly from the outside. They fully documented the complete heavy torpedo launch configuration without requiring any physical penetration into the sealed forward compartments. The detached outer fairing plates lie crumpled in the immediate vicinity of the main hull. This creates a highly localized area of structural separation. To understand the full violence of the foundering, investigators must look beyond these immediate torn steel plates and evaluate the wider seabed perimeter surrounding the wreck. This evaluation reveals a profound forensic absence. Standard deep ocean sinkings almost universally produce a massive, widely distributed scatter field. When a heavy naval vessel breaks apart during a long, uncontrolled descent, the kinetic tearing throws hundreds of tons of fragmented steel, deck rigging, heavy piping, and internal machinery across acres of the open ocean floor. The explicit absence of this wide scatter field at the 226-foot depth serves as a critical piece of non-physical evidence. The localized detachment of the lightweight bow fairing is the only significant separation on the entire site. There is no wide wreckage pattern radiating outward across the white sandy bottom. Standard archaeological grid mapping relies on charting widespread debris to understand the exact angles of structural failure. Because the site lacks this debris, the team is denied this traditional method of analysis. This clean perimeter creates a severe limitation for forensic reconstruction. The lack of a distributed scatter pattern limits any further kinetic modeling of the descent impact. Without hundreds of scattered structural components to map, measure, and geometrically calculate, investigators cannot reverse engineer any complex mid-water breakup dynamics. The environmental evidence is strictly confined to the immediate footprint of the single heavy hull. With no distributed debris to model, the reconstruction could not go further from perimeter geometry alone. With the forward torpedo geometry completely mapped and the seabed perimeter proven utterly clean, the external evidence gathering phase is fundamentally complete. What is the final management verdict on the future of this legendary submerged artifact? A strict choice hung over the site: extract components through destructive salvage, or preserve the wreck as a complete historical monument and accept the limits of external evidence. Authorities chose preservation. Heavy recovery, cutting, or forced penetration was prohibited because the aged steel was fragile, and tearing into sealed compartments to reach batteries or motors would destroy the very architecture the operation sought to understand. In practice, the wreck is treated as protected underwater cultural heritage, documented, left in place, and not worked as a quarry. The survey's lasting scientific value was a high-resolution visual baseline of the wreck as it lay on the seabed, dimensions, settling angle, and overall integrity captured in a single reference record. Future expeditions would return as monitoring missions, comparing new imagery against that baseline to measure slow deterioration over time without introducing physical damage. The forensic survey operation was a complete, unmitigated success. The remote archaeological teams achieved every single declared objective. They perfectly identified the specific historic wreck. They successfully mapped the complete external footprint of one of the only Type XXI submarines to undertake a wartime patrol, and one of the most intact surviving wrecks from that revolutionary class. They definitively proved the precise external mechanics of the final foundering. Most importantly, they secured this critical historical data while executing total operational restraint. They perfectly maintained the strict non-contact boundary, refusing to violate the structural integrity of the asset. The final legacy of the submarine is oceanic isolation. The heavy steel cylinder will not return to a dry dock, and its internal engineering will not be open to air. It rests in silence on white sand, and the North Atlantic will consume it over the next century, weakening plating, collapsing compartments, and erasing the machine in slow motion. The site is protected and watched remotely, measured against the baseline rather than disturbed by hands.